Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.
And welcome back to Open Your Eyes. We're now moving into our first segment, which of course will be a double up with these fine gentlemen that we've got. This is of course our COVID-19 update, all courtesy Fulltech Systems. And the topic surrounds reflections on state of emergency and crime, especially within our region and our country. Criminalizing poverty, the high cost of security. We've got three esteemed gentlemen in with us on the screen actually. Dr. Herbert Gayle, who is a lecturer. He's a researcher as well at the University of the West Indies, and also does anthropology, studies anthropology, of course, that's what he does. Greg Nunez is in with us as well. He's in his final year, PhD candidate on social policy, and Bryton, who is in his master's. He's a master's candidate in Canada on leadership and management. Gentlemen, good morning and welcome.
Morning. Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Definitely, it's nice to have you in. We know for a fact that this is definitely one of those topics that it needs to have. It's something that we need to talk about, and I think for the most part, it's being swept under the rug. Or even if it's had, it's mostly among friends rather than across the nation. Now, we know that you guys put out an article. We'll be getting there. But firstly, I want to introduce in Dr. Herbert Gayle, who, of course, was in Belize for a period of time and dealing with this same situation as we speak. Dr. Gayle, good morning once again. And tell us, you've left the country a few years ago, but you've heard of what's going on. Have you seen a change, or what do you notice at this particular point?
Well, it's an interesting description of my leaving the country, because I've never left spiritually or chakrally. I'm always aware of what goes on in Belize. But part of my team is still there, and I still move back and forth to and from Belize. I was in Belize a couple of years ago. Okay. So I have a long-running relationship with Belize.
Yeah, you're one of us now.
But are things getting better? I tell you honestly what I've seen. What I've seen is that the work we did back in 2008 up to, I think we had the book launched in 2016. So we had a stretch of interrupted work, and we've seen things taper off. Let's use that word. Let's say you're watching a car going very quickly, and then you happen to engage a different gear and it slows down, but the brake has not been applied. So even though things are better for the work we've done there, a lot more could have been done. A lot of time has been wasted, because if you have an application, of which I'll come to later, of 3 tiers of application to the reduction of violence, and you apply a couple, you still need to do the final one, which is the primary, which is to engage young people at a far wider scale. And that has been missing in every single country I have seen in the region. So not enough has been done, not enough of the structures have been changed in order for the country to come out of the transition from being owned to being owner of yourselves. So tons and tons of work is needed. But in summary, there has been some positive changes. The problem is that it is simply not enough.
You've often said in interviews and in your presentations that one of the downfalls that we have is in how we measure the effectiveness of programs in addressing crime and violence, that we're not going to get a quick fix, and in fact it's going to be sometimes as much as a decade before you're able to see the results. Is there any more effective way that you found to be able to communicate this to people, especially as you go about and continue your research?
Well, communicating with people is always a challenge, because people normally hear what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. And quite often these days, I mean, when I go to countries to work with their military or security forces and so forth, before you begin, the disclaimer is often that I'm going to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, because people come to meetings and people listen for what they want to hear. And people are always charged like that in, what is he going to tell me that I don't know already, and so forth. I think the way to get people to understand things is to, as cantankerous as it sounds, is to keep repeating until it begins to stick in the heads of those who carry a natural resistance and those who force themselves to be slow. Because people are usually very, very smart. I was listening earlier, and if you want to wake up people, say something that they find uncomfortable, you'll see that they actually read the paper or listened. But if you say something that they can ignore, then they force themselves to ignore it. So communication has to take a wide frame. In other words, we can't just write books. People on the ground have to have dance hall sessions or have some other types of sessions that are cultural, in which people attend and which the data are broken down for them in skits and in all sorts of ways. You have to come at people from different angles and work with them in the language and pattern and frames and everything that they know. So at the end of the day, there's no excuse that you never heard.
I want to come back to that, but let me get Bryton and Greg in. You recently published an article in the Mandala talking about the high price of security. And I just want to ask if you have gotten any feedback and what the response has been. Because, and you can weigh in on this, given the fact that we've had this conversation on the show a few times, it seems to be that in the COVID context, at least we can say for now, there's very little empathy for the men who are currently in their second of what will be 3 months of being locked down.
Yeah, so in terms of feedback, I think the general public, a lot of members of the general public had an opportunity to read it. People responded to us favorably in terms of understanding exactly what the issues are and kind of widening the discourse around criminality, around violence in Belize. But in regards to, I would say perhaps the leaders of our country, we have not directly received any feedback. And that may be, of course, like you just said, the lens as to which they are looking at this thing. Currently, it's the focus is more on an immediate fix. So it's not about the long-term discussion about how do we move the needle forward, but it's more about addressing the immediate concerns and safety of people. So I think that's the lens that many of our leaders have been looking at it. So we have not received direct feedback from them as yet.
Yeah.
Bryton?
I absolutely concur with what Greg stated just now. I think we're in a position where we're trying to fix or ease a situation that has been going on for a long period of time. And there are so many pressures coming from the higher echelons of our society, and that is being pressed onto our police department, for example, our social sector, and that pressure is trickling down to our junior police officers and the way how they interact with young people on a daily basis as well. And so we haven't received that direct feedback from anyone in leadership capacities, so to speak. However, we've received feedback from the general public on the article.
I've got to say kudos for this, because then there are a lot of people who actually feel just like you, young gentlemen. They feel that we need to continue with a voice, but Dr. Gayle made mention of something very important, and that is to the fact that people tell you what you want to hear, not what you need to hear. And so I wanted to ask you guys, Greg and Bryton, what prompted you to want to write this? Because one of the things, especially in our little Belize, you become basically the glass for the stone. Because once you're able to voice your concern, once you're able to say something that is effective to our country, then people might say, oh, these guys are becoming now glass to stone. What prompted you guys to want to even write this article?
I've been on the scene for a while now, working with Dr. Gayle, studying in a particular field. in terms of social sciences and looking at disenfranchisement of young men, the social exclusion that they experience. And quite frankly, in 2017, there was a discussion that was being held in terms of mediation and the different types of intervention that the police department particularly and a selective group of interventionists were engaging in. At that point, I also noticed somewhat of a streamlining of perspectives, and I felt that there was a need to widen that discussion. So I also wrote an article in 2017, but for 2020, upon my return, that was when they instituted another state of emergency, and it felt so familiar to an experience that I had in 2018 when I returned to Belize to do field work, that literally at that same time, they also instituted what I would argue was the first SOE of its type in terms of locking down the young men without trial or any criminal charge. So the level of familiarity with it, I felt as though I had to contribute. And I reached out to Bryton, of course, because his field of study as well as his vocality in terms of having people understand things and engaging people at the social media level.
Yeah. So let's get into the crux of the matter here. So you're speaking about the state of emergency. You call it a high cost of security. And let me bring it back to Dr. Gayle for a moment, because the last time you were here, you did a presentation on this very same issue. You've done research looking at Jamaica's pattern in using state of emergency and its effectiveness or ineffectiveness, and how Belize has been following suit. So Dr. Gayle, if we could just get some insight on that, on the use of state of emergencies, locking down people without charging them as a way to quell violent crimes momentarily.
All right, let's start first of all and talk about what is a state of emergency. It is basically a paramilitary measure that is used to address a crisis. So whenever there is a state of emergency, it is suggesting that there's either a disaster, a natural disaster, or a social disaster. Okay, so for COVID, you may need that. But the problem I have with the Caribbean states is that it is quite often the first or second measure they run for. It's not very far from their pockets. It's like the small change that they always have that's always jingling so everybody knows it's available for use. And the way it is used, again, is not worth the sacrifice. So a massive sacrifice comes with state of emergency. In other words, a set of people we call the target in military research is going to be addressed by the state. That group is considered to be the greatest threat to the state. And those would be, in our context, young men, not young women, not older people, young men, right? And the darker they are, the more a threat they are. Wow. So in other words, we already know that that states of emergency in our region has a specific prejudice to meet something called social order. The problem with our region is that we've never had social order. So what is the social order you're trying to achieve when in fact we've been born in chaos and we're trying to achieve long-term social order? The second problem, right? So after sacrificing, the second problem with state of emergency is that it is used continuously. Rather than being used within a context of a tripartite frame, it is used continuously as a lone frame. What are the three things we expect? Primary, secondary, and tertiary. If you use a state of emergency, it can only achieve something. It's called a ceasefire. It can hold. But if you hold, you then have to do what is called the secondary, which is the redeployment of combatants. So let's imagine you found 100 young men who are involved in high-profile crimes. If you have a state of emergency and you now have access to them, because that's what it does, you then have to redeploy them. If you send them to prison, you're only going to create a frame for people to fill that vacuum, and therefore you're going to have 100 more criminals that you declare criminals filling that space. But if you redeploy them, as in you provide them with social work you provide them with institutionalization, as in schools and training and so forth, you would actually have done tremendous good to your society. And then long term, you have to then look at what it is that caused these young men to have been there in the first place, which means you have to look at what point does the state become responsible or stop its responsibility to education? How much money is invested from the national security? Are you one of the countries that have more than 50% invested in force but not in the social side of security? You have to reassess what you have, and you have to invest long term. You have to answer the question, the ontological security question, not just the military security question. In the next 10 years, what is my country going to look like? And that is what we call governance. But what we do in this region is that we continue running the state of emergency because it is like a sweet. Once a state operates a state of emergency, it gets immediate forward from especially the mature citizens. Thank God we can breathe little air. And there are all kinds of thank God. And we become addicted to it because by the time you're pulling the pot cover and the steam begins to fly out, because a state of emergency is like a pressure cooker, right? And things are getting bad again. You apply a new pot, right? So you have 5-6 pots of state of emergency on one stove, and eventually there's an explosion. If you look at all the research on states of emergency, what it shows you is something very interesting. Over a 5-year period, you are likely to have from a state of emergency, over a 3-year period, you're likely to have a 5% increase in violence, because at various points you have to lift it. And as soon as you lift it, the murders begin again. It simply does not work unless you're going to work it within a system in which you use it to hold so you can repair. If you only use it to hold, you can't hold people forever. And that is what makes it so useless.
When you look at because Jamaica's been doing this for longer than we have, when you look at the patterns that were established there, what kind of similarities do you see happening now in Belize?
It's the exact same thing with states of emergency wherever in the world it is operated. It's going to be the very same pattern. You actually have 4 things happening. Yes. Right? The first thing that happens is very, very simple. There is a crisis, you apply it. You apply it, but you do absolutely nothing else. As soon as you apply it, the murders go down and everybody is having a ball because, wow, the murders have gone down. Then when you do that, persons continue to beg for it, because remember that most persons in your population, in our population, in any population, Trinidad, Jamaica, Belize, the 3 cases mostly, people are going to begin to ask the state for it. Which set of people? Everybody except the target. So that's what is interesting. It is extremely, extremely prejudicial, because the older people, they're asking for it, and I've seen it in Belize, I've seen it in Trinidad, I've seen it here. Women ask for it. Everybody thinks now it is a panacea because you've been using it. I call it morphinization. Have you ever seen people who need a surgery get some morphine and begin to laugh? That's precisely what happens. They forget that the surgery is still needed, and they can stay there on the morphine until they die without the operation. The point is that a surgery is needed, a surgery in the primary structures of Belize, Trinidad, and Jamaica. And then you have to have the secondaries in which you find ways to make these young men feel like young men, because what is the requirement of them? They have to have money for people to accept them. Irrespective of all the changes we've had in the social and psychological structures of our societies, if a young man has no money, he is not going to meet the dying and fractured patriarchal frames that we set up for him. This is not the same for women. And it means when you lock a young man down, you are hindering him from carrying out the role that anybody's going to use to identify him as a human being. When you release him, he is going to explode, or he's going to explode on the people around him while you hold him. Because if you notice, incest, all sexual predations have increased under COVID in every single state I have studied. Can you imagine when you continuously hold young men that you declared are predators in the same spot and position for a prolonged period of time? Picture what happens to the people around them and what happens to them as a social being.
Wow.
And even the disbursement of crime, violent crime as well, is something that you have noted in Jamaica, for example, in other parishes. You lock down one parish, then you start to see little outbreaks in others as well.
But not just that. Yes, that's for certain, but not just that. Every time you have prolonged state of emergency, there's an increase in the balance from gang violence to domestic violence, because the same people who were attacking gangs and moving and having inter-gang violence and intra-gang violence, as in between gangs and within gangs, they are now the same ones you have at home. And therefore, if you look at the studies all over the place, in every state of emergency, the very same people who think they are not the primary targets wake up and realize they are the secondary targets, because we're all connected. So if I live with a woman and I am the target, I am going to transfer the aggression onto the woman. So in every state of emergency, there's an increase in intimate partner violence against women. Wow. So the same. So recently, I had a discussion with women, and I was saying to them, stop asking for stuff that is going to harm you within a few weeks, because now you see the men being harmed, and you may feel, oh, hey, there's a gender competition here. We're not on the same ship. We're having a lifeboat philosophy here, where if the ship sinks, we get the chance of jumping on the lifeboat and moving away without recognizing that actually you're in a spaceship philosophy. If you hear a sound happening to your brother, you are next. And this is what I'm trying to get into the heads of people. Stop the gender divisions, stop the color divisions, because at the end of the day, the rat story is going to catch up on you. If they put a rat trap, everybody's going to have chicken soup. The chickens are next. So we have to begin to work together as a team of people, as a bunch of black people or non-white people, or whatever way we want to describe ourselves. We're going to have to begin to look at this thing together. We're going to have to begin to listen to what we need to hear rather than what we want to hear.
Now, some of the sources, and I'd like Bryton and Greg to feel free to jump into the conversation as well. When we talk about some of the root causes of crime, we're talking about some of the lacking social structures that exist in our country, that we know, that we talk about very casually. I'm sure you guys tuned into the recent House debate when there was the extension, the additional 60 days for the state of emergency for the men who are locked up. And for the first time, we started to hear, in some cases, some cold, hard truths, and in other cases, of course, some of the excuses. And one of the things you will always hear, I'm sure you do, is that poverty or being poor doesn't make you a criminal. And of course, there are lots of young men who grow up on the South Side, who were black, who didn't have any privileges, who didn't turn into criminals. How do you respond to things like that? And what were your thoughts on the debate in the House?
Greg,
I think Marlene, this comes back to what we call in leadership the polarity of thought on these issues. What we're seeing is that there's a continuous shift in our poles of thought, and specifically in leadership and within the police department, there is an approach to crime and violence where we move from this community policing approach or this collaborative approach where we bring stakeholders on board to deal with a situation. And when the pressures start to come down, we see that there's a shift in the polarity of thought to a more traditional extremist militant approach. And what this does when we use state of emergencies, for example, so readily, is that it creates a sort of a degradation of the efforts of the community policing, for example, and the other social sector services that are provided to mitigate this very issue. So we see that there tends to be a vicious spiral in terms of the response that we get from using these type of mechanisms. As Dr. Gayle rightfully stated, is that the state of emergency, why it is ineffective, is that there is no sort of social rehabilitation or social mechanism implemented after the state of emergency ends. And that is when we begin to see the spike in cases of violence resurging. And this is simply because when you bring together young men and you just scoop them up from their homes and you take them to the Belize Central Prison at the Colby Foundation and you come out and you say that you've signed a peace agreement with these young men and there's no social mechanism in place, what happens in that process as well is that if in fact many of these young men are a part of gangs and are affiliated with gangs, they start to put names to faces and you start to get more targeted homicides directly after the state of emergency is dropped. And so we need to think more long-term in terms of our approach. We need to think about what will be effective to sort of hold that ontological security that Dr. Gayle speaks about. How do we see our future, how we want it to be, as opposed to just the short-term good feel that we get from the approach taken. I find it very mind-boggling that we've seen in the House of Representatives, after 12 years of being in government, our Minister of Foreign Affairs stood up and said that this problem is one that's been ongoing from the time we entered into office. A lot of these young men who are now a part of gangs were 4 to 8 years old when they entered into office.
I know.
And so it speaks to just the targeted approach that has been missing within the actual strategic plan of dealing with the problem.
But you know, there's so many things, especially with this conversation, because yes, we all listened to it, and Bryton, mind-boggling indeed, because we're actually hearing leaders saying, you know what, we're failing the people, we're failing these children from 4
Well, we didn't hear all of them.
Yes, you know, from
that
4,
one,
and these are the guys who are actually carrying out the crime now. And there is something about how we socialize that I'd definitely like to get in. But we've actually seen the police department going out there and trying to speak with these families. I don't want to use the word blame, but let's use the word responsibility. Is it the police responsibility to try and curb things in the area, or actually the community? And, you know, I think the conversation needs to start there. And I'd like Greg to chime in, or you, Bryton, or Dr. Gayle, in terms of the responsibility of trying to get these young men to understand a different way of life. Who's got the heaviest responsibility here? And what can we do to help them?
I think if I could just chime in quickly, the social service providers are at the forefront, or should be at the forefront of change if we want to see any long-lasting change. However, what we see and what we experience is that the police, being the face, so to speak, of the state, oftentimes paints this picture that indeed this is the road that's being taken by our government, because at the end of the day, state of emergencies have to be passed through the cabinet and it has to be approved by the state. So I think we need to start looking back at what the social sector can do to mitigate and should be doing to mitigate, and how we could bring them on board in collaborative efforts in order to get to a viable solution.
Greg?
Yeah, I concur as well. But I think the issue in terms of our community is the lack of empowerment. We have seen at different stages in our post-independence history where we have attempted for a very short time to empower the communities by improving the socioeconomic status and the various dynamics within the communities. But it's rarely ever long-lasting, because as soon as the level of violence increases, we see a reversion to the hardline policing tactics. And as Bryton is referring to in terms of the community policing is good and is extremely necessary in terms of a philosophy of the entire police department and how it engages with the community, especially young people. But it has a limitation as well. There is an extreme need for the social service providers to come in. There's an extreme need for our leaders to recognize that there is an evaluation that has to occur within, especially within the South Side, and not just the South Side, but especially for the South Side, that the economic advances have not been achieved in terms of the South Side. We have not seen that, and that is why one of the more introspective, or rather retrospective approach by one of our ministers in establishing that for the past 12 years, and not just the 12 years, but using the life course of the individual to show that from age 4 to 8, we've been in power. We've had the opportunity to elevate and to improve the lives or the quality of life of these people, but we have been unable to achieve it. Is important. I think that's an important first step to recognize that perhaps we should change our politics. We should start focusing more on community development as a long-term plan, as opposed to every 5 years, or what may satiate our needs for the next general election. And it also helps us to look at how our institutions improve in working within these communities. And I always go back to Restore Belize, simply because I know that Dr. Gayle was so intimately involved in it. And I also worked at Restore Belize in 2010 to 2011. And in its inception, we're talking about an entire decade ago. Mm-hmm. And it's clear that there's a level of apathy that comes with the general public when we continuously talk about SOEs and about the police coming into these communities, and of course, shifting away from the more social components that is necessary to empower the communities. But we also have to recognize that we've had sufficient timeline to change the quality of life for these people, and we've essentially failed as a community, as a nation, to have 10 years go by after developing such an intricate plan as to how to address the entire life course needs of someone from the prenatal stage all the way to the geriatric stage. We've essentially failed, and the recognition of that, I think, is an important step.
You said something, and I kind of really just had a drop my jaw moment, because now that I think about it, I can recall exactly when Restore Belize was initiated. I can recall clearly the Prime Minister heralding it as a new way forward to be able to address what was a rising situation in violent crime way back then. Mm-hmm. There were big launches and commitment for money, and I'm not saying that they haven't done work. They have been doing programs as we've been moving along. They were able to allow for some of the studies that we're referring to right now. But it seems that the efforts that have been put in place, just what are your thoughts on it? Is it just they're not going far enough, they're not going deep enough, they're not resourced enough? Where are we falling short?
If you look at the literature, all the concept papers referring to Restore Belize, it does not refer to an implementing agency. Yeah. It really is a secretariat that was designed to coordinate the efforts of all of our existing institutions, including our ministries, departments, the various NGOs, and all of these stakeholders coming together and starting to identify the key areas that we need to develop on in order to improve the lives of people. And what we've seen gradually was a shift away from actually coordinating the efforts of existing agencies or institutions to an implementation body. And that aspect of implementation makes the individual effort of, for example, Restore Belize seem smaller in terms of what it could have initially addressed. The papers that Dr. Gayle wrote focus heavily on wastage and duplication of efforts that we see within the NGO community as well as within our government, within the government institutions. So developing that framework and that secretariat that would have allowed us to be able to work together as a collective body to achieve a particular goal was shifted, and it shifted very quickly.
Is the fundamental problem here what our expectations are in terms of being able to address crime and violence? I mean, we look at the political structure of our country, and we tend to measure politicians based on the results that we see. Streets are an easy one, right? You pave it, it's like we have streets. But being able to address social issues like crime and poverty and unemployment, these are the things that, well, not that's a whole other story. But these things take a longer effort. They take more resources, and it's not necessarily one of the politically sexy things to be able to invest your resources. So I ask that question because it takes a great deal of effort on all parts to really be able to address this problem. You're talking about looking at children who have been exposed to a great deal of violence and trauma, whose fathers and uncles and older brothers are currently in jail without being charged. You're looking at the teens who are probably being recruited into these gangs at this moment. You have those who are in the who are in the prison right now, whether it's under the state of emergency or for being charged for a crime or convicted of a crime. And then you have the other people in society as well. So it's a continuum of efforts that have to be made. And from the outside looking in, you know, we say, well, where do you start? And where do you get the fastest results? Who wants to take that one?
All right, let me jump right in a little bit. If we look at the difference between a high risk young man and a low risk young man, and by high risk we mean that he has stabbed or shot someone, he has maimed or harmed someone, or he has been maimed or harmed himself. All right, so if we take those persons to be the kids who are at highest risk of harming or being harmed, then and compare those to the people we call sheltered boys, we're going to see a massive difference. We're looking here at data for 3 communities in Jamaica, and also combined with communities in Belize and Trinidad. So we're looking here at the largest data set I've worked with, which is literally 6,000 young people. Okay. You can't have a data set bigger than that because there are actually cities in the world and towns in the world with less than 6,000 people. So listen, what's the biggest difference? The boy who is sheltered and the boy who is at high risk is literally 19 times more likely to be a gang member if he doesn't have family support around him. Wow. He's 17 times more likely, right, to be a part of a crime family. So we're talking here about families. Then the next issue is torture. He usually is tortured by family, by caregivers. Then we have desperate poverty, right? He's been hungry for a prolonged period of time. Remember we spoke about kids who would go to the pipe every 15 minutes to get a handful of water to cool their stomach. You cannot tell a human being who is at that level of poverty that he should not become a predator. Then we have intimate partner violence. He sees his mother and father warring. Then we have heavy economic pressure. He has been asked before the age of 12 to hustle so that the people in his house can eat, not just for himself. And the other one is his family members are involved in unstable occupation. And the last one, he has seen a lot of violence. If you look at all of those things together, no human being should have experienced all of those. Okay? So in other words, you've created an environment that simply breeds violence. That in fact, if there is no violence, then that would be abnormal. Let me say that again. If we allow young people to live in environments in which without violence they cannot survive, without violence they will die, then violence becomes a necessity for life. And then how do you use a state of emergency to address somebody who cannot live without violence, because violence is the occupation he uses to provide food for self and for the females or others around him? How do you address that? And so there is this large question of how we begin to look at family. Because if you look at the 5% of Belizeans, 5% of Belizean males between age 15 and 34 would have become high risk. 5%, not 90%, 5%. If you look at their lives, you'll find that they do not have one stable parent. Not one of them have one stable parent. A human being requires at least one stable parent in order for that person to be stable. But if you look at the central family form of the kids who get in trouble, it's called alternative, meaning I do not have a single biological parent. Or if they have a single biological parent, the relationship they have with that single biological parent is absolutely disastrous, because when we ask them in the research across these 3 countries to grade the one parent they have, the scores are usually below 5 out of 10. So in other words, if you have a system in which you create an environment at the community level for people to have some idea of what family looks like, what an environment looks like, right? It means that you're going to have very dramatic, though gradual at first, reductions in violence, reductions in murder. If you do not change the environment, but you come with a hammer or a belt and you beat up everybody, or a stick, you beat up everybody, and then you leave them back in the same environment, you're coming next year to beat them again. And the next year, and the next year, until it feels like diarrhea. And that is the essence of the problem in the region. Nobody's doing the hard work, right? If you look at all the social systems that have failed in the Caribbean, they amount to the very same thing. Out of $1 for national security or for dealing with the problem, you get $1, you spend 1 cent or 2 cents, or the most we've seen is 10%, so 10 cents out of every dollar is spent on this area, as if it's like an add-on or a secondary issue. And then you spend 90 cents out of the dollar on making sure that them tantody, that them stay with them there. You understand? And so if you're spending out of 100%, if you're spending 70 to 90% on addressing social order through paramilitarism, and then a measly 10 to 30% on the real work, you are not going to get anywhere. And that's the story of the Caribbean. Every single state in the Caribbean that has a problem with violence, that's precisely what they do.
Wow. And just to use that as a piggyback from my previous question, I mean, we in the wider society, and I love where Greg and Bryton in their article talk about, I think you use the word othering, but it's kind of where we start to separate ourselves from the problem. But a lot of times people from the outside look in and they just want to see something now. And it seems that it then becomes a political mandate that, okay, 10% goes towards maybe restructuring families, because we're not going to, or to empower families, because you're not going to see the results immediately. But if you put it in your police, and if you put it in boots on the ground, that's more visible to people. So our own expectations, I guess that was the point I was getting at, is part of the problem. Would you agree?
But then you need to have social marketing. And this is absent. This is the most absent thing in the region. You need to have a social contract with people. I mean, I've listened to the people, and I've been around all the people who have made this journey successfully in the region. And I'll tell you, when I say all, it's a play on words, because there are only 2. There are 2 examples, Nicaragua and New York. There is not a third region, part of a city or a country in the region that have colonized people that have done a successful job, because the society, the people demand immediate change, because a long time we have suffered. We have suffered a long time in a valley. How if you have suffered for all these years, and you're going to tell me about 20, 30 years, you're going to see this thing come down. But it took centuries of torture for us to get here, for it to be built in your DNA how to survive through violence. Centuries of learning that violence works. And every time a policeman backs down or smack down, or whichever term we use, a child, that child learns, wow. So if I box down somebody else, them learn. So the thing is, there has to be social marketing. And I've been around the folk who've done it. Giuliani, go back to
quality of life crimes. That's how he cracked down and started that change. There was a tipping point.
There's a vast project, 3 to 5 year project, and in some cases shorter, where there is a hammering through media every day that we are on a trajectory of 10 years. In this year, this is what we're going to achieve. In the second year, and believe me, people are smart. If you show them where you're going, if you become transparent, a word Caribbean people don't know about, big expletive. If you become transparent and begin to work with people and show them what we're going to achieve every year, and you achieve that every year, people will buy in eventually that, hey, let me keep this government in power. Let me repeat that. For the politicians who want to stay in power. Let me keep this group in power because we're on a journey. But that's not what we do. What Parliament and the other people do is the other people, the othering that Greg is talking about. They pretend that they are doing policies towards people rather than for people, rather than within, as if they are part of this. They're doing this thing about we are going in this way and you better come along, rather than all of us are going on this journey. And that kind of humility is needed for policymakers to take the region forward through social marketing. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
We certainly are.
We certainly are indeed. But I tell you what, the conversation is a very good one. It's one we need to have. We need to take that break, though. We're discussing reflections on state of emergency and crime. Part 2 of that conversation is coming up when we come back. So stay with us.
If you're looking for low-cost television advertising, have we got a deal for you? Advertise on Channel 5's Daily Classifieds. Channel 5's Daily Classifieds is one of the most effective methods for introducing yourself and your business to the community. Use our Daily Classifieds to recruit employees, promote specials, promote your products or services, promote a business opportunity, increase traffic to your website, and advertise items you have for sale. Let us help you save valuable time and money. Call us today at 223-0146 or visit us at our offices on Pony Drive to discuss how we can help your business grow affordably. Channel 5's Daily Classifieds. Advertise today.
For over 20 years, Great Belize Television, Channel 5, has been the leader in award-winning local programming. We have also produced some of the best video commercials, documentaries, and live events for clients countrywide. And we continue to offer high-quality production services to maximize your advertising needs for your business or organization. From concept to completion, let us help you achieve your marketing goal by producing your commercial, documentary, graphic animation, live event, or even designing your website. Using state-of-the-art equipment and experienced personnel, we can make your ideas come alive. For more information, come see us on Coney Drive or give us a call at 223-0146 or 223-7781 or email us at gbtv@dtl.net. Great Belize Productions, making great television in Belize.
And welcome back. We're back, and we're now moving into this, of course, reflections on state of emergency and crime. Our second segment is, of course, that as well. In with us, Dr. Herbert Gayle, who is a lecturer, researcher at the University of the West Indies. We have Greg Nunez, who is in his final year, PhD candidate on social policy, and Bryton Codd, a master's candidate in Canada on leadership and management. Guys, once again, welcome back as we move on into our second segment. You know, one of the things I wanted to discuss, and I was having that conversation a while ago with George, the way we're socializing at this particular point, it's changing. I've got children, and for the most part, the children nowadays, Marlene and guys, they're on a gadget. They're not outside, they're not playing with anybody else, so their social skills have changed or will be changing over the next few. This is definitely something I think we need to venture into. Social skills and crime. is there a match there, Dr. Gayle?
There is, I recognize that people are concerned. I've seen projects that say go outside. There was actually a project called Go Outside, Please. And we have all sorts of concerns. But the truth of the matter is, we have to remember that cultures don't change overnight.
Yeah.
They gradually change based on what we have. And that our generation, once you say something like that, you've just given away your age, because it means you're part of the group that created the gadgets for the generation that are using it now.
Yeah.
And it means that you are going to see things differently. But they have already worked out how to move back and forth from outside into their play area. I see my son set up his own long jump around the yard and does his own thing and run up the hill and run back down and then come back on his gadget and so forth. And it's not abnormal for them. Mm-hmm. What's genuinely missing is the lack of community operating at the sphere where there is direct impact on young men. Mm-hmm. So when I was growing up, anybody in the community could hold you and say, go back to your mother, go right back down, where you're going. Mm-hmm. Now, because things have become bad, the human species gets into what is called self-preservation. Mm-hmm. So a person will see a child going down the road with a gun and says, I don't have a good relationship with that boy, let me not say anything.
Not
and
my
they put it
business.
into their house rather than come out and say, hey boy, put on that and go back to your yard. Mm-hmm. So it's that the community spirit is what is broken down. And believe me, we are a people that do require community to be effective. But it means a few brave people have to go back to the gyms and the community centers and begin to start programs or continue the programs they have so that spirit is continued in a more structured way. And so there's a shift away from unstructured to structured, and the same results are achieved. Yeah. We have to respond. Every time a culture changes, all the generations have to work together to respond to it. There shouldn't be any alarm. It's not going to kill you. It's the lives of the people, but we have to respond.
Yeah. You know, we closed off the last segment starting to touch the surface in terms of how important the family structure is as a part of contributing or to a life of violence and crime, or perhaps swaying you away. Now, of recent, we heard both the Commissioner of Police in Belize and the Attorney General advocate for parents to use corporal punishment in the homes as a means for us to get our kids back on track. And Bryton and Greg, you touched on this in your article, and I have to say you documented what was my first thought. I was sure if they did a survey and asked 100 men who are currently locked up behind bars whether or not they were spanked, we can generally assume what the answer is, and that would be yes. But let's talk about your perspective on it as you posted on in your article. Greg? Do we still have them on board?
Well, I listened to the explanation of it where they tied it to our laws in terms of being able to correct a child without causing grave physical harm. But I think that it stops a little bit short of looking at of the more challenging ecological issues related to how young people are raised especially within the inner city of Belize City. Yeah. And it certainly doesn't give justice to how we can juxtapose that at a particular time in our history that Belize City was responsible for the largest amount of child abuse, including physical abuse. Mm-hmm. And somehow these young men were able to come out how they are. Which would suggest to me that there is a larger issue at play. And if you just use that kind of logic to look at, for example, the productive members of our society, including members of the Belize Police Department. If you look just one day on the television in terms of our news, you will see that there's somehow competing elements between the politicians, between the members of the police department and the young men in getting into trouble. They share a large part of our newscast about who did this, which police officer was responsible for abuse in this area, or was selling gun licenses here, or was, impugning the police department, or you would see a politician being accused of some form of misappropriation or something that we deem as wrong. But somehow it is only applicable to our young men that we're supposed to beat them. When we look at the police department, you would ask, is it that the rogue elements of our department, were they actually beaten? Were they actually physically punished in order to not have them be this way? And you're talking about civilians who have not been trained, who are not legally, who are not gainfully employed, but somehow we're able to put them into the same box, but yet at the same time isolate one particular group and say, when we could beat them, maybe that will help to fix them. I don't see a tree, if you have a young tree growing and it's bent, that the best solution is to actually start to beat the tree or break the tree. I think you would carefully find solutions that would help you to organize and structure the plant in a way that will grow to be the right way. Yeah. And I think that was the angle as to which the focus is really.
Yeah. But it also ties so closely into what the research does say, as Dr. Gayle was mentioning before, in looking at some of the indicators that would lead you into a life that involves violent crime, and that's torture at home. Now I want you to break that down for us, Dr. Gayle, because when we think torture, maybe we're thinking extremes, and it doesn't always start that way.
Yeah.
All right. I am preoccupied with repeat killers, as in a young man who killed once, killed again, and the highest number I've met now is a young man who started killing at age 9, who killed 35 persons. Wow. Before he was killed 2 years ago. He died 2 years ago.
Wow.
And he killed 35 persons starting at age 9. He killed a shopkeeper at 9 years old and robbed him, and didn't stop killing until he died 2 years ago. And at that point, he killed 35 persons. I have been preoccupied with those persons to the extent where I have now interviewed and worked with 291, which is, I am told, probably the highest in the world. Now, if you look at their lives, every single repeat killer was tortured as a child. Every single one. I struggled because there were 3 who I couldn't work out, who said to me they were never ever tortured. And I went through and continued to go back with them until they got themselves killed, until I discovered that they were tortured immensely psychologically, including one who was called the garbage bin. That was his nickname by his family. So even though those 3 out of the 291 escaped physical torture, their psychological torture was so immense that they never needed to be smacked around. Now, what fascinates me is, and we know we're going to talk a little bit of politics, is the constitution of parliaments in the region, where mostly men above age 45, making up over 75% of our parliaments, and the Belizean parliament is quite interesting. I've been noting it for quite a while. That they operate like gangs themselves. I don't know if you've ever noticed. One person gets up and come up with a cray idea. Notice I didn't say crazy. I've borrowed a word from my younger friends.
Yeah, from the young folks.
A cray idea that says, I think we should beat them. I think we should hang them. I think we should buy an electric chair from the United States. What do you think? And everybody says and operate like a gang. Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
because the parliament doesn't have young people or a significant number of women who are going to ask the question, why are you going to do that? Then the bills and stuff are passed very easily through parliaments, but they make no sense.
Yeah.
So the constitution of parliaments in the region is something that needs to be addressed. They need to look more mixed. They need to have young people. They need to have women. People who will actually not hurry and pass bills or have discussions that are monolined, because guess what? The guy who normally makes sense in the parliament said it, so the rest of us should follow.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of problems we're having, because nobody who has had the chance to think this through, who have read a few books, who have spoken to somebody who works in this area, such as a Greg or myself, right, would have come up with such a brilliant idea to go and flog people who have DNAs relating to being flogged. Remember, we've been through slavery. We are colonized people.
Yeah.
Every time you hit me, you wake up the DNA. You wake up my monooxidant type A, monoamine oxidant type A variant L. You don't want to do that. You don't want to kick off a storm of provoking my warrior genes when I'm already the product of all my parents who had suffered immensely.
Yeah.
What you want to do is not fight fire with fire, because we know it's going to be a big hellfire. What you want to do, as Greg explained earlier, is you want to bring some water to this situation, right?
Yeah.
The other day I said to a minister of national security, I won't name the country, and I said to him, have you ever sat down with a gunman? And he looked at me and I said, no, not the ones that you send out to do damage. And he goes, oh my God, you can't say that. I said, yes, man, we're talking. I'm saying, have you ever sat down with one as your brother? Not othering. Notice that word, Greg has used that word, and it's a tremendous word that people may pass by. Not the othering, not to say that I'm the parliamentarian, I'm the policymaker, and you are this creature out there that I need to
The monster.
or control. And he said to me, he's never done it. And I said to him, find one of the young men that you people are always using and abusing, sit down with him and have a talk about his life. And then you can come to me and I will come to your country and help. He called me the other day to say, boy, it's been a long time. Dr. Herbert, you're wicked to me because I cried after I spoke to him. He has no life, Doc. He has no life. He's a walking dead. Yeah. He has no ontological security. Yeah. And I said to him, that is precisely the problem. So this is not somebody who, when you threaten him that, hey, we're coming down here to beat you up, it means fly. He's already been hungry. He's already been battered. He's already stabbed up somebody or get stabbed by somebody. He's already shot at somebody. What can you really do to frighten him? Let me tell you how you frighten him. You tell him and show him that you are going to make him change. And he's scared of change because he doesn't know what is going to happen. That is the most scary. I have worked with tons and tons of young men across 9 countries. And I tell you, when I tell them that we're going to change, you're going to change and you're going to become a good guy, you're going to go back to school, we're going to send you back to school and you're going to do something called CXCs or CSEC. They are in shock. For days they can't sleep. When you see them the next time, they look weak because they are now going to, somebody cares and they have to go through in their head, is this guy, and let me just say, there are sometimes you try to help young men and they ask you, are you gay? Because they can't believe that you're going to help them and they don't have a vagina. We have to begin to be honest about this thing. How are you going to beat them?
I mean, how concerned are you? And all of you can weigh in on this, because I think from a logical standpoint, when you say we have a situation, a challenge, a problem with violence in our society, and our ways to fix it is go in the house and inflict more violence. Yeah. I can't tie together the logic in it, and we know beyond that, there is so much data, so much research that already says that one, children who grow up and follow this particular path are very often time victims themselves of terrible forms of abuse within their household or witnesses of terrible abuse within their household. Yeah. So I'm trying to understand when we see, and maybe there's a human behavior or psychological reaction that we're having that we have this disillusionment with nostalgia, that back then when we used to hang people, there wasn't crime. Back then when we used to publicly flog people, it worked. Back then when we used to beat children, it worked. Why is there something that takes place in us that maybe we need to understand and deconstruct better?
Sorry, let me chip in here, and then I'll go quiet so my younger friends and colleagues can speak. Did you know that between 74 and 85% of all parents who beat their children to the extent where the child is hospitalized had experienced the very same thing growing up? I am not just concerned about the immediate flogging or beating or abuse or torture of a child. I am concerned about the fact that this is precisely the creature you're creating for the next generation and the next ellipsis, and it goes on and on and on. Unless a group of people called government wake up one day and become honest with themselves and become brave enough to say, let me do the social marketing and teach my people that there's another way, and start this process, we are going to be back here, Marilyn. We are going to be back here in another 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, until we're all old and tattered and we're dragging our legs, and we become the raisins of the earth, because it's not going to change unless somebody or a group of us start this process. Yeah. Every battered creature attacks other creatures. It's as simple as that. Wounded lions bite worse than healthy lions.
Yeah. Dr. Gayle, just before we get the guys to weigh in on this, very important. At this particular point, we're seeing children having children, and they themselves don't even understand how to probably instill discipline. And I hate to use that word, because while I say it like that, I feel like I'm actually saying spanking. I feel like I'm saying something physical just by using the word. And we did mention, or we did speak about torture in the home. Some folks right now listening to the show would tell you, hey, I don't beat my picnic, so I don't know what you're talking about. But they must have said something, or they continue to say things to torture the child. And I want for us to give a definition of what that is in the home, because that is exactly where it starts. So I'd like for you, Dr. Gayle, to weigh in on that. I don't beat my picnic, but at the same time, I might say things, or you might say things in the home to eventually torture that child. So let's put a definition behind what torture is. Give us some example of what that could be.
All right, for torture to occur, you expect three things. One, it is harsh on the physical and psychological senses. Two, it is prolonged, as in the activity is repeated, which is why fathers, when you interview boys, they will tell you that my father hit me one time, and me and him fight, and he does list it under torture because the father didn't get the chance to come back the second time to do it, because he realized the boy turned man and the two of them going to fight. So it's not torture. It's the person who you won't hit back is the torturer, because there's a psychological barrier called monotrophy that stops you from hitting her back, as in mother, auntie, and female teachers. Because if your male teacher hit you, it's going to be war after school finish, right? So the torturer has a psychological protection and can continue, so it's protracted. And the third one is that it has long-lasting damage. If you go to the WHO, you'll see a fourth area that says there's a differential impact. In other words, you can tell Greg that, hey, Greg, I'm going to give you the 5-star treatment. And all Caribbean people know the 5-star treatment. Big, old, dirty thinking drunker. That's the 5-star treatment, we call it, that is given to 45% of all young men in the Caribbean. 45% of all young men in the Caribbean have been described as big, old, because they go fast after they get to 13, dirty or nasty, stink, and have been compared to a drunkard because they are dark-skinned. 45% of Caribbean people. So understand that even though they may escape the physical, they end up with the psychological frame that says, I am not good for anything. Now, once a child has gone through that, protracted for a long period of time, it takes the child to a point of self-acceptance of not being good. And then here's the problem with torture. Because the torturer has a psychological or a monotrophic luxury that blocks the child from retaliating on that particular person, such as your teacher or your mother or your aunt or your older cousins, all of those persons, then you take it out on the other persons. 50%, the largest group of males who batter women come from this group. So if you take 100 men who batter women, you will see the transfer of aggression on them, because the largest group, we would think that the largest group are men who have a psychological, who have a mental problem. No, they're actually in the minority. The majority of people are those who are battered by persons they couldn't hit back. So they take it out in the next relationship they form. If you look at rapists, same thing. A lot of rapists were tortured. So it's three things again, right? One, we're talking about harm, long-term harm being done. We're doing this backwards. Two, it had been done protractedly to the point of acceptance as normal. And the first thing we need to know is who is doing the torturing, because the person who is doing the torturing must be somebody who has a word that Greg understands very well, but I'll try to break down for everybody else. Legitimacy. That person is treated as having the right to be institutionally violent to me. And once you get all of those together, you're having a scenario of extreme torture where that's going to produce very violent people in your society.
Wow. I tell you.
Yeah. I think that there's so much in this conversation that leaves us with a lot to think about. And I guarantee that there are people watching right now who still have a high level of skepticism when they think of persons who have engaged in criminal activity. They will see a situation where we're not holding young men who have committed crimes, robbed others of their personal belongings or of their lives, accountable to their actions. What's the right balance here? How do you talk about who they are in conjunction with what they have done?
Jump in, Dr. Gayle, or Greg, or Bryton.
All right.
I'm wondering why Bryton and Greg aren't answering up. Go ahead.
There is a point that we escaped, and sorry, Marlena, but I can't leave without pointing it out to us.
Yeah.
That people make this statement in complete ignorance that they used to beat the boy long ago and there was no massive violence. Lie. It's one of the biggest garbage you will ever find. You know who used to pay for boys being tortured? Women.
That's right.
And the people who make these statements are actually unaware how sexist the argument is. Because back in the days, a man would break his woman's arm and that's it. And I've had to sit down with policymakers when they say these things and say, stop. Are you suggesting that the women who used to get batterings left, right, center, above the center and below the center in the past were not humans? Because they were the recipient of the torture. If you take my friends in Somalia, if you take the other countries that I've been working with indirectly, and I've been looking at what's been happening to them, they torture the boys. Same thing in Kenya, same thing, it's worldwide. They torture the boys take it out on their partners. And this has been going on for centuries. But now it becomes an argument that people ignore all of what was happening to women in the home, because now the men are taking it out on fellow gang members. So now it becomes an issue, and some people may not even see the sexism in it, but now it's become a major issue, and big studies being done, including myself, because it is now visible. But it was invisible. It has been invisible for centuries.
It
Where the
still
woman
is.
wears dark glasses and all kinds of stuff because she was the end result. The end result is now spread and has come from the invisible to the visible. And that's when people are seeing what's happening about the impact of torture. If you look at the period in which we're having tons and tons of discussion about torture, it's now the issue when it is in the visible. But we have to be able to think a little more broadly about what's been happening, because you cannot torture somebody and get away with it. It's as simple as that. Somebody pays.
And I'm trying to tell you there too that it still is an invisible problem. We still don't have enough data on domestic violence, on sexual violence. We have what is reported, which we all know is only a small portion of what currently takes place every single day. So I want to bring Bryton in, because Bryton, you also shared something I think that was really important. And it's not something that I think we discuss often enough in Belize, and it's the racial profiling that often takes place with the interactions with police. And you documented your experience, and I want to give you the opportunity to be able to talk about it and also share your thoughts on how people view this issue in Belize.
Marlene, there is no covering up the fact that there exists a deep level of racial profiling within the policing department. I'll start there. But we also need to come to the reality that there is one racism in our country, covert racism at that, and there's racial discrimination, cultural profiling and discrimination. And we see these things being used in the approach to try and get that quota filled within the police department. I speak now directly, which is given directly from the upper echelons within the department. I could tell you of my personal experience in just the past 3 weeks, which I've been profiled 3 times. I've been stopped twice and my identification has been taken. And I understand that this information is documented in what is called a SITREP system. And if you're arrested, it's inputted into the SIMS. And the SITREP is basically a situational report of what happened when you were stopped. Now, I think it's profiling because it's reaching the point where if you look a particular way, if you are a black man, and I'll start there, and you have a certain feature and you match what a gang member or a criminal looks like, then you automatically become a target of some suspicious activity. And so you're pulled over, and let me be very clear that a lot of our police officers are not very well trained in how to approach civilians, because they have this very hard-on approach that every single person that you meet is indeed a criminal and will not necessarily comply with the demands by the officers. And so we really need to understand that there is a deeper issue at play as it regards racial discrimination and profiling. And if we look at, for example, the state of emergency, I would put my money on the table in saying that a lot of the young men who were taken to the Belize Central Prison the first time in March and then later on in June were actually people of my cultural demographic, how I look, my ethnicity, and also, if I could say, these are Black people who are being targeted in particular. And so we need to also have the conversation around that, in recognizing that not because I am a Black man, that I am automatically a criminal.
Look, I'll tell you what, one of the things that we discussed earlier as well is the Band-Aid effect, like Dr. Gayle was mentioning. But for a lot of people, and having these conversations, they tell you, man, when you take these guys off the street and you take them to the central prison, there is actually a decrease in criminal activities. There is actually a decrease in crime. We're saying here that that is just a band-aid effect, and like like Dr. Gayle said, you know what, there's a thing called a pressure cooker, and when you open that pressure cooker, there is a whole pile of steam, there is an outburst of steam. And I think one of the things to quell these situations is the buy-in of people. And I think that's one of the ways that we tend to be very reluctant to make happen, whether be it politician, whether be it the police department. Because if you have a buy-in with people, or people understand what this pressure cooker effect is going to be, then eventually they will be the ones to help out as well. Simply means that the police, the people should help the police. We're supposed to be instilling these things, especially in our younger ones. Dr. Gayle, or in fact, let me go to Greg. Greg, how important is the buy-in to the public, and what do you think we could do to continue to engage the public in for them to actually see this effect, that, you know what, this thing is not going to work? Because people at this particular point, we're thinking, hey, this the work for we, because we're not hearing the criminal activities or actually the level that we're so used to hearing. Greg, what do you think we could do to get the people to buy into this, to what we're seeing at this particular point?
We've expended a lot of energy and resources to improve the relationship between the police and the citizenry. And I think there's need for recognition that each time police officers are put at the front line to be responsible solely for all aspects of the lives of these young men, that there's an erosion of that very confidence that they've attempted to build their entire time. And I would think that any police officer who has engaged properly with the community would recognize in himself or herself that, in fact, it is not primarily the solution that we need. But the general public needs to ask itself a very important question. And it goes to the individual person. What have you been able to do lately? Or how have you positively engaged with a community or young men to be able to say that, in fact, something is being done? Because if you're absent from the overall formula, then it would suggest that government is not enough, that the police department is not enough. And I think that is step one in being able to identify where culpability lies. And culpability lies with all of us. It's not just the police department that's responsible for dealing with these young men. And certainly having these band-aid and repressive approaches will not solve the problem. It is our businessmen and businesswomen who are able to provide opportunities for these young men. It is our schools, especially the secondary schools, in being able to retain these young men without the need for premature departure from the school system. It is the institutions that we rely on, including CYDP and all of these social service providers, who should ask themselves each time that we visit these households, how are we properly documenting the plight of these individuals, that we can be able to identify from early those who are at risk. Yeah. If all of those elements of what is an important equation of our society is missing, then there is no proper fix anymore. That is the fix in itself. It's a collective approach in terms of the village helping to raise a child. Yeah. And where that absence is, there's individual culpability and there's collective culpability. So in no way am I attempting, or any of us are attempting, to hold the police department solely responsible. Yeah. We're saying, in the same way that Bryton has expressed, that there needs to be a polarity in thought that allows everybody to be able to see that there's a challenge ahead of us that needs everybody to be involved. And that collective approach is what will obviously develop that buy-in. Yeah. We had an opportunity in 2010 to develop what was called a safe zone in the Yabra community. Within the Yabra community, we had all of the service providers come in, and we were able to document an entire neighborhood or entire community and see what the special needs of that particular community was. And I think that there's high time now that we do that across Southside or across Belize City and all of these areas where we're starting to see greater foothold of the gangs. As we established before, especially in the article, it is no longer simply a Belize City issue. It's an issue that affects many of our districts. Corporal has seen these spikes, Orange Walk, Cayo,
Dangriga.
Dangriga. So essentially, you're talking about the entire country that is starting to see this ripple effect.
Yeah.
So the collective approach that the people in Dangriga or the people in these different rural districts can no longer see that this doesn't happen here either. We need everybody.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Very important that what you guys are saying. The next thing I really wanted to really quickly touch on, we're seeing the rise of one of the Central American, one of the biggest gangs in Central America, actually showcasing themselves. And recently in the news we saw that happening in Belmopan. Now, what should be the approach? You guys are studying. And I really and truly like, especially when it comes to leadership and management, social policy with Greg. What should be the approach in dealing with these young men? Because we know that they're very young people. What should be our way forward with dealing with them? Greg, Bryton?
I think there's a delay.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, again, I keep going back to 2010 because I believe that was a year. That was a pivotal year where Dr. Gayle was specifically tasked to bring together all of the stakeholders to be able to discuss this general issue of improving the social ecology, especially in Belize City. And there was a conversation that was held, especially with the senior ranking police officers at the time, that if we are unable to grapple with the issues related to the domestic gangs, those gangs that we have traditionally known to be located in Belize, we're not going to be able to deal with the gangs, those imported gangs, right, or those transnational gangs, like the MS-13 or the 18th Street and all of these variances. And because they are essentially immigrant, a lot of them come from immigrant communities who see that there's a weakness in the central political authority in terms of how we're able to police ourselves, how we're able to make proper decisions to improve the lives of our own. I think that it leaves a huge gap, as Dr. Gayle mentioned earlier, that people are able to use. And we need to create greater emphasis on improving what we see as our domestic gangs now, and so that we can get to that point where we could actually reduce the possibilities of external gangs starting to infiltrate and take over.
Yeah. And just one more point as we start to round off the conversation. We often talk about crime, violent crime, as a separate topic from what we see as white-collar crime, the corruption that we see in our country. Yeah. How important is it that we remove the system, the inequity in our system that currently exists? I mean, we've heard stories. I know there's always the story of Singapore and cracking down on corruption and how that was a change for them. Different cultures, of course. But I think the concern here is we always are aware of crimes that are taking place at the top level. There's always an assumption of the inequities in the system that will exist, from how you're policed to how you're processed through the judicial system, and even to what your sentence and time in jail may potentially be. How does this impact the current context of crime?
All right, if I may, something. I had an experience with Minister of National Security for a country in the region some years ago, and I know he says that I scarred him, so I'm hoping to scar a few more of them.
In a positive way?
That is, yes. I asked him how he would react if he went to another country and saw a child about 14 to 16 years old, hungry, skinny, barefoot or in slippers, and unsupervised, just walking the streets. And he said his heart would be moved. So I asked him to give me the profile of the children that he arrests. And he went to the bathroom. He couldn't answer the question. I'm certain if you take one of your ministers in Belize and ask them the same question, you'll have the same experience. They'll feel so moved for a child who is not Belizean, who is hungry, skinny, barefoot, or wearing a dirty slippers and looked unsupervised walking the streets, they as a human being would be moved to help this person. Then if you ask them for the profile of the children they arrest, they are going to realize it's the same child. The only difference is that this time this child is yours. Going back to this issue of othering that I'm begging us not to let escape us, right? Hungry, look at the boys who came out of the bus that you had in the video. They look hungry, skinny, they're barefooted, are in dirty slippers, and they look like nobody had supervised them to the point of showing them how to comb their hair, showing them how to wear their clothes or something. And I'm certain that it is easy to look at them as criminals, but if you had somebody from an outside situation who can't other in the sense of what is called intra-othering, as in the person is actually your own people, but you have found a way to separate yourselves from it, that is when it's going to hit you about the depth of lack of empathy that we have. In the study in Trinidad was probably the biggest wake up, because in Trinidad, it is the police officers in Trinidad, they describe people as African and Indian. They don't describe them as Caribbean, which is interesting. In Trinidad, there's a community called Bangladesh, because the Indians there are poor. Let me not get into that politics. It's called Bangladesh. It's Indian police officers who beat up the Bangladesh young men. And when you go to John or Laventille, it's the black ones who beat up the black ones. Can you see the difference? They are othering, intra-othering. They are othering within their own people, not across race. And so it's been fascinating how we can look at one person, right? Because my next question to this minister was, if you see a girl walking on the road, hungry, skinny, barefooted in slippers, looks unsupervised, looks like nobody has ever taken care of her, what would you do? And he got very tearful. I have a daughter. That is, no, a girl can't be on the road. I said, so what's the matter? What's the difference if a boy is like that? Your own boys. The inequalities, the lack of empathy in the region has been absolutely fracturing. Even for anybody who comes from outside and look at what we do to our own, it is something that really drives your brain to a point of hell. Because if we ever take the time out to stop and examine carefully what we're doing, we'll see that we are creating a problem for tomorrow.
All right, and if we could close off on something that you said in the beginning, and I promised I'd come back to. You said that since you started doing work with Belize, you have seen some progress. And perhaps that is one of the points we can close off. What are some of the things that we're starting to do right or have done right so we can continue at this point in time?
I think the number one thing for me is the fact that we're having the discussion now. Yeah. That is a benefit. That is an awesome benefit, because I remember my experience when I just came to Belize. People were telling me, yo, Bale, we already know them thing there. Where you come here from? Right? That was the attitude of a lot of people I've met on the street. Yo, Bridget, we're glad to you're a black man like ourselves, but we know them things there already. There's nothing you can do that we don't know already. That is where we started. Our entire research team was seen by people as people who were telling them about this stupid thing called research. Today, Belizeans, when I speak to Belizeans, they understand that there is a need for a scientific examination of the problem. Then we had, so that is called a research appreciation. Then we had Restore Belize, which was supposed to be a secretariat, which was supposed to be crossroads of a new era. It hasn't gone precisely, but it has actually caused people to have a point of discussion and a point of intervention. Yeah. And also, we've looked at the changes in government, as in, I remember some minor changes happening, like there's a split between security and police, and a number of other things that came as a result. And now the final thing is that in my last presentation, my last public lecture in Belize, persons wanted to bring the VIP program to Belize, and that's awesome. Can't wait, and I'll say it again, can't wait for them to say we're ready to start doing the violence interruption program, the Chicago Cure program, which to me will work wonders in Belize because it will get hands and hearts on the ground in an organized manner. So that for me is tremendous. The direction we need to go, though, the government needs to look again at this issue of the education system. Moving on from the old elementary system with different pieces of tape all over it, to a modern education system that sees the government pushing people all the way through to tertiary, not in any ad hoc, not based on any frame of who know who, but a structure that says that once you are a child, the state is responsible for you, and taxpayers' money must make sure that you're educated. So we have a lot to go, but we have begun the journey. That's the point.
Okay.
Excellent point. And Bryton or Greg, any final words from you guys?
I think I'll just leave the nation with a food for thought, with a quote that resonates with me in the field of leadership, which is, you cannot lead a nation to be healthier than you are. I think that is a very powerful food for thought, simply because what we expect in terms of behavior and demeanor in our brinks of our society ought to be reflective of what's happening at the top. So if there is corruption at the top, if there is these types of behaviors that are against the legality of our laws or for legislation, then what do we expect down the line of command, so to speak, or down the hierarchy, so to speak? Yeah. We need to hold our leaders accountable. They need to hold themselves accountable, and we can move from there.
All right. And Greg, we can't end without hearing from you. Final words from you.
Yeah, I would reiterate Dr. Gayle's point about the education system. I recently conducted field work, and I've been analyzing the data, and in just doing a cross-sectional analysis between those young men who have been excluded or expelled from secondary school and those who ended up committing a crime, there was over 40% of the young men who were expelled actually ended up having a criminal charge within their lifetime. So I would emphasize that we really do need to focus on the education system, ensuring that we can retain these young men, and where there are issues of behavior, where there are behavioral issues, we need to start focusing on developing second chance programs and alternative education programs to continue to productively engage young men within our formal system.
Excellent. Dr. Herbert, Gayle, Greg Nunez, and Bryton Codd, guys, thank you so very much for spending an extended period with us this morning. It was an excellent conversation on reflections on state of emergency and crime. Once again, guys, thank you so very much. We need to take a break, though, and when we come back, we will be, it is that time of the morning whereby you put the kids in front of the TV to learn something new from Dr. Binox. We'll do that when we come back.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.